So let's get started with our first story. And this one really, I have not seen very much other than the National Catholic Distorter who was celebrating what went on. So the kissing cardinal, you remember this is Cardinal Fernandez, who is the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, what used to be called the Holy Office. The supposed to be the top doctrinal chief in the church. You may be saying, why am I saying the kissing cardinal? Because you remember in his earlier, younger days, he wrote a book about passionate mysticism and how kissing and sensuality were part of spirituality. I mean, it's a pornographic book that no priest should have written and should have disqualified anyone to be able to position the curia, but that's who we're talking about. Well, he went over to Cologne to give a speech to the theology department there at the University of Cologne, and it's about the document on dignity that, if you remember, some time ago we reported on in one of our shows when the castery came out of it. It was approved by Pope Francis, and it was this whole jumble about infinite dignity, and we looked at different aspects of it and said how it was confusing, contradicting of doctrine, etc. um, and so in this speech he wants to address that document and explain it a little bit more. What does he do? He essentially tries to weaken or water down what we know the church has said about these horrible bodily mutilations, which they're calling sex therapy or treatment, right? Essentially, these surgeries where the male or female body parts that one is born with are mutilated. And the church has always been opposed to this, has been opposed to trying to say, turn yourself from a man to a woman. And again, some people who might read latch on that he says, that the church is opposed to the ideology of transgenderism. And this is a classic Francis move. He says the church is opposed to this ideology, but there's exceptions in cases where it's not driven by ideology. If you remember Amoris Laetitia, the church is in favor of and still supports all of her doctrine on the indissolubility of marriage and is opposed to the weakening of marriage. But practical praxis and pastoral care that deals with real situation on the ground aren't actually controlled by that principle. So the fundamental flaw is you have a principle that does not actually control particular circumstances. So in his talk, which occurred on February 17th, again, he, like Pope Francis, talks about the human body shares in the dignity of the image of God, and that's why sex change, quoting from him in an English translation, is not merely an external change or comparable to normal cosmetic surgery or surgery to cure a disease. It is about the demand for a change of identity, of wanting to be another person. So he condemns the ideology of transgenderism that leads to this. So you might read that and say, he's defending, this principle. But then there's always the second shoe that drops. He goes on to say that this, what he's just said, does not exclude that there are cases outside the norm, such as severe dysphorias that can lead to an unbearable existence, which demand evaluation with greater care. So he goes on to say, what we are saying is that the ideology that usually accompanies so many sex change decisions includes the denial of the reality given as a gift, with the idea that bodily sexual identity can be the object of radical change and always subject to one's desires and claims of freedom, right? So notice it's very subtle. Notice these subtle words, right? He says, normally this ideology, it usually accompanies sex change. So he said, we're opposed to the ideology, but it usually accompanies the sex change, but in some cases it doesn't. So if it doesn't, it's not done for ideological reasons, then he's implying it's okay, right? This is exactly the approach of Amoris Laetitia with divorced and those living in sin. Again, then it's another typical modernist liberal canard. he sort of wants to take you to an extreme, non-existent case to pull your heartstrings. So we don't want people just flipping their genders around, but maybe in certain cases there's extreme dysphoria. And then again, he doesn't outright say the church handles it, but those cases have to be held with great care. Well, what does that mean? Right? It's implying there's exceptions to an immutable rule. So just like with sacraments to those who are living in adultery, well, the church is opposed to it. In principle, you can't, but certain circumstances have to be dealt with great pastoral care. It's the exact same 1-2 step. I'm upholding the teaching of the church while I'm saying doesn't apply in extreme cases. Then basically every case becomes extreme, right? Oh, well, that's extreme. That's extreme. And the fundamental principle that he's putting out there that we have to reject is that there is this thing where people could actually not be in the right body, where they're so suffering from believing they're in the wrong body. And again, that they may have that false belief, but that is a mental illness that needs psychological treatment. Say you think you're somebody you're not. Like if I go around thinking I'm Napoleon and try to go to Waterloo and start a battle, I need a psychologist to get me out of my delusion. They need that, but he's trying to imply with great care, well, that maybe if it's real serious, it's better that they get a sex change, which is that basically like the Pope Francis, it's better that we just let them go to communion than they leave the church. It's a lesser of evils argument. So really in a full, very subtle modernist swoop, he opens the door for an acceptance of these things that Donald Trump, has blasted in the United States, and the Democratic Party has found complete loss of support for. So as the rest of the world is realizing this whole transgender thing has gotten out of control, he's trying to open the door for the Catholic Church in certain extreme circumstances with great care, kind of acknowledging it. He has learned from the master, Pope Francis, in this respect. So be wary of it. This is an opening. This is how they always open the door to these things. And if you accept it in one case, you destroy the principle.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the end goal here. And I'm kind of surprised this hasn't been covered more in Catholic media. I suspect that it's because people are thinking, well, this might not be a strong case to make against Cardinal Fernandez because he does come out strongly against the ideology. But if
Right.
we look at how this is being done in practice, we're already seeing this be done. For example,
Yeah.
we've covered this on the show before. Bishop Stowe has allowed that transgender hermit to go wandering around, who's
Yes.
openly she's a woman, but she's masquerading as a male monk. And that hermit even met with Pope Francis and with New Age ministry. So this is already being done. And if anybody knows anything about the transgender ideology, you will never deal with, and this is what Cardinal Fernandez is mistaking, is that you'll never deal with somebody who is claiming to be a part of this transgender community who says, well, I don't have severe dysphoria, I just am like doing this out of an ideological principle.
Right.
No, every time this community works and is speaking, they always say the same thing. They'll say that transgender hormones and transgender surgeries for children, like puberty blockers, it's necessary because the dysphoria, if they don't deal with that dysphoria, will inevitably kill them. And that's why they'll say things like Donald Trump is killing trans kids, because what they mean is he's not going to allow them to get these surgeries, doesn't allow them to get these hormones or puberty blockers. It absolutely opens the door. It's something to be aware of, and it's already happening. So once again, we see the negative fruit from this sort of ambiguous language that really started with the conciliar movement, with even going back to the Vatican II documents. Something can mean, because it's surrounded by orthodox statements, something could mean that it can be interpreted in an orthodox way. But in all likelihood, we know exactly how it's going to be interpreted. We already see it being interpreted. This does not bode well for us in the future. So I think this is just another example why everyone really should be separating ourselves from people like this, and from a movement that is accepting of, sex changes, or even for sex changes
Yeah.
for children. If this is showing the bad fruits that even went back to the Second Vatican Council with the ambiguous language, I think that's something we need to stand firm on.
Absolutely. And before we leave this story, one final point. He also throws into this another reminder of sort of the destruction Pope Francis has wrought by referring to the death penalty. So he
Mm.
says, in talking about dignity later on in the speech, the firm rejection of the death penalty by Pope Francis shows the extent to which it is possible to recognize the inalienable dignity of every human being and to admit that he or she has his or her place in the world. Because if I do not deny it to the worst of criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. I will give everyone the opportunity to share the planet with me, despite what may separate us. And again, this is, as we've talked about before, a complete denial of the ordinary magisterium teaching on the death penalty, and this misuse of the concept of human dignity to rationalize changes in church teaching. So just sort of for good measure, that gets thrown into the speech.
And one thing to note on that, because I think this is important for everyone, because some people get scandalized when they hear, "Oh, are you denying the Second Vatican Council?" Well, I mean, we have to look just from a reasonable perspective today with something like the death penalty. This is the most obvious, really, of all the
Yeah.
cases. And Dr. Fazer does a good job of showing this in his book on the death penalty, that this has been taught by the church in an infallible and irreformable way. It cannot be reversed to say, well, actually, it's intrinsically evil. So when you have something like that, this shows that in principle, the church can teach something non-infallibly and still be contradicted by previous magisterial
Yes.
teaching, and
Mhm.
that does not mean the gates of hell prevailed against the Catholic Church. And the same principle applies to some of the more ambiguous documents of the Second Vatican Council that have been interpreted in a way that is contrary to Catholic tradition, contrary to the Catholic magisterium. And this is the way people have to approach this from now on. We cannot be so, we see this with so many people today being scandalized by the fact that there might be some discontinuity between modern teaching and
Mm.
past teaching. The church is stronger than that. It's built on a stronger foundation. The gates of hell do not prevail merely because there is discontinuity with the teaching. But we have to be realistic by looking at these documents, looking at these teachings, and understanding they can't be reconciled with tradition, just like this statement with the death penalty.
Yes, we remember that balanced position, right? To not throw the whole church out with our discerning of what we can and cannot follow.